Hi everyone, EggnHam here. I just recorded my first ever YouTube interview for my first ever YouTube channel, Educating EggnHam. Who says you can't teach an old dog new tricks? If you're adventurous, hit like and subscribe before even watching the video. Educating EggnHam is all about taking the sensationalism and pettiness of politics out of an issue. The aim is that no matter what side of the aisle you sit, you gain a basic understanding of the problem and what options the government has in solving the problem, and what we as individuals can do. The first episode is about inflation and the cost of living. I interviewed Gigi Foster, a professor from the University of New South Wales. I'm extremely appreciative of Gigi accepting the interview and giving me her time. Gigi was fantastic given that I have no background in the media, let alone interviewing people. Gigi was probably very patient with me, it's fair to say. I learned a thing or two, that's for sure, not only about inflation and the cost of living, but interviewing. It is harder than you think. Given that I wanted to keep things to an hour, I rushed the ending and didn't summarise all that Gigi had taught me before closing off the interview. The end seems a little messy. We all start somewhere though. We live, we learn, we do, and we get better. Enjoy the video, and whilst you're watching and maybe subscribing, I'll be looking for more people to educate old EggnHam. See you next time. Welcome to the first ever episode of Educating EggnHam. Today I'm joined by the super smart economist Gigi Foster. Gigi is going to try and teach me about inflation and the cost of living. It is not an in-depth analysis, but a basic overall understanding, so I have a bit of an idea on the type of job the government is doing. After all, we want good government, not bad. Gigi, how you doing?
Very well on this very rainy day here in Sydney. How are you, David?
Yeah, not too bad. It's actually sunny in Melbourne, so
Oh, that's a
it's a bit of a
change.
difference. Exactly. Um, Thanks for joining me. The reason I reached out to you to do this interview was not only because of your fantastic qualifications. You've got a degree in ethics, politics, a doctorate in economics, but I admired your free thought on the way governments handled COVID policy. People may not have agreed with you. You're obviously against lockdowns, but you weren't scared to present an articulate, well thought out opposing argument based on the data you saw. Do you think we've actually learnt anything from COVID, or do you think people have just forgotten about it and wanted to move on?
Well, I think it depends who you talk to. I've certainly learned a lot from COVID. Um, I've learned a lot about the Australian character. I've learned a lot about crowd psychology. I've learned how badly corrupted many of our institutions have become. But if you talk to, for example, government representatives during the COVID era, or even most people on the streets, I don't think that there's much inclination to revisit seriously and critically the decisions that were made for a whole bunch of reasons that we can go into, but that's probably a podcast of its own.
Yeah, well, exactly. It is. I mean, and you just look at people wanting a royal commission for it. Some people, and it's probably politically based, but people want a royal commission, and other people are like, let's just move on from it all.
Yeah, no, very
Yeah,
much. And I don't
so
know if you're
it is interesting.
aware, David. I mean, we have a lot of what I call restoration movement organizations that have developed recently. I've co-founded one of them. In fact, I've got to do a plug for it. Australians for Science and Freedom. There we are. So that's
Oh, there you go.
a cross-disciplinary free think tank that I founded last year with some similarly minded people. And we are going to be, well, we already have participated in efforts to have the COVID policies reviewed and to do it properly and to bring attention to the institutional failures that led to those very poor decisions and to build alternative structures to better suit the needs of Australians. So that's a whole side of my work now that I do very much on the side of my normal job, but I think it's very important to
Yeah.
try to help Australia to move forward out of the catastrophe that was COVID policy.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, everyone was locked down, weren't they? So, and as you say, we've found a lot of mental health issues out of it and everything like that.
Yep.
So,
Yep. No, it's a huge, huge amounts of problem,
Uh,
and we can talk about that another time if you want.
mm, yeah, exactly. Um, so what we're going to do today is take the pettiness of politics out of the equation and just discuss the problem of inflation and cost of living and what can be done to solve it. By the end of this video, hopefully, people not only understand the problem but know what to look for from political parties either side of the aisle when they're presenting policies they wish to implement as their solution. Um, but before we get into the nitty gritty of it, one of your research interests is behavioural economics. What is behavioural economics, or what does a behavioural economist do?
There are probably as many answers to that as there are behavioral economists, but the way I would describe it is it sort of sits at the intersection between economics and psychology. So it's a subfield of economics that focuses very squarely on human decision making and what you might call irrational aspects of human behavior. So why we may do things impulsively or in a way that seems not to be in our own best interests sometimes, why we may be persuaded by things that are not really true or good for us, ways in which basically economics models of human behavior are not accurate because of the realities of human nature. My mom was a psychologist, so I kind of have an interest, a very strong interest in human behavior, particularly human behavior in groups, which is one of the
Yeah.
reasons why I thought COVID was so interesting. Behavioral economics understandings or insights have been applied in a range of different areas, including in the private sector, but also even in the public sector. So you may have heard of BETA, the Behavioral Economics Team of Australia. They are a department that sits within Prime Minister and Cabinet down in Canberra. There's also one here at the New South Wales government. There may be one in Melbourne
Mhm.
too, Victorian government and other states, which essentially advises different departments about how to optimally target their policies, how to interact with clients or Australians to try to improve uptake of policies that are thought to be good or reduce behaviors that are thought to be bad. So there's a whole kind of industry that is using practical insights from behavioral economics to try to supposedly improve the world, although that can also be abused, of course.
Well, yeah, it's it is interesting. Well, it's like market. It's looking at. I suppose it's looking at marketing, isn't it, and everything like that
Yeah,
too.
there's a very
As
strong crossover with marketing. Yeah. In fact, I like to call marketing one of the persuasive industries, which has basically no bearing on productivity. It's kind of just a freeloading industry. And, when you think about what makes Australia prosper, it's what you don't think of is all those people in marketing departments wondering how they can get you to buy their services, right? So yeah, and how do you do that? How you persuade people is often drawing on insights from behavioral economics about what makes us, what draws our attention, what makes us fearful, what makes us find something appealing, what makes us more likely to choose in favor of something that will reward us in the near term versus the further term. How can we be manipulated via our altruistic tendencies, which is a big one, has been a big one since
yeah,
COVID. So there's just a whole range of different things. That again, that's a podcast in itself, probably.
well, as you say, human behaviour, isn't it? It's here and it's all over the shop. Okay, let's start educating old eggs. Inflation, and cost of living. What actually are they?
Well, I mean, the main difference, I suppose, between inflation and cost of living is in the specific items that we're talking about, where prices are relevant. So, inflation, as a general concept, is the notion of prices going up. So it could be
Yeah,
of what you're buying at the store. So grocery, bills may go up, or housing costs may go up, your rent may go up. Um, Mortgage
yeah,
repayment costs may go up. Anything you buy, energy costs may go up, possibly because of government intervention, etc. Right? But also the labor from an employer's perspective may go up. So that's the wage rate, right, or the remuneration rate.
yeah,
So those are also prices in a sense. So any price in the economy potentially could be part of what we mean when we say inflation. We're talking about rising prices of goods and services in the economy. Now, cost of living is usually something we are talking about in relation to the kind of comparison between income and expenses for the average household. So you might
Yeah.
say, well, my income isn't rising as fast as my expenses are rising, right? So the price that I'm being paid for my labor isn't going up as fast as the prices that I have to pay for food, lodging, energy, etc. And that then means that you've got an increase in the cost of living. In some sense, if all prices about, across the economy were all rising at the same rate, it kind of wouldn't matter. I mean, it kind of would probably, but it's not as big of a problem as if there's a mismatch. Because when there's a mismatch, that's when things get out of whack. And unfortunately, that often happens when you have a high average inflation rate, because there's just heterogeneity across the different prices of goods and services in the economy. Not everything grows at the same rate. And so when you don't have that kind of reasonably low inflation, the RBA's target band is 2 to 3%, you open up the possibility for high variation in the growth of prices. And that can then mean that wages, for example, which tend to be what we call sticky in economics, they tend
Yeah.
not to kind of move as fast as other things. They may not keep pace with the prices of things that consumers are having to spend their money on. And so that means that they end up having to cut back on their expenditures, having to maybe not take holidays, maybe not be able to save. In worst cases, maybe skip meals. They're not having in the winter. I mean, there are serious problems that can happen, obviously, with a really
Yeah.
significant rise in cost of living.
And well, do you do they work together, or are they independent of each other? Because, as you say, if inflation is 5% and your boss only gives you a 3% pay rise, then, as you're saying, inflation is outstepping what your income's going to be.
Yeah.
So do the cost of living and inflation work together, or are they independent statistics
Well, to really understand that,
or measures, I should say?
yeah, you have to understand where these price rises are coming from. And there are
Yeah.
multiple sources. So, for example, if you think about an increase in the price of cheese at the supermarket, right? Right now, as I recall from the last time I bought it, maybe a week ago, a big block of cheese is something around $11. That used to be something like $7 about 2 years ago, right? Now, that's a
Yeah.
big rise. Now, where could that come from? You think about the backstory of where that cheese, sort of was on its journey to you and what went into making it. That's where you're going to discover at least part of the explanation for what its price is. So, part of the reason may be that the farmers who are making the cheese might be for example, having to pay higher wages to the people who are milking the cows, let's just say, right? It
Yeah.
could also be higher costs of renting the machinery that produces the cheese from the milk from the cows, right? There could also be a reduction in the number of cows or the health of the cows, which then makes it more expensive to produce any given gallon of milk or liter of milk, sorry. And that then may lead to a higher cost of the cheese. So there's a lot of different sort of production line aspects of what goes into making cheese that might feed through into higher prices at the retail counter. So that's one possible thing. Another thing that could be
Yeah.
going on is there's just a lot more money circulating in the economy in general relative to the amount of economic activity going on. And that's kind of a more of a macro level mismatch between money supply and need for money or demand for money in the economy. And
Hmm.
unfortunately, that is something that we saw in spades during the COVID era because we saw the government pushing pause on the economy, right, which means basically dropping the level of activity in the economy while plowing
Yeah.
money into the economy via programs like Job Seeker. So at the time, I remember having conversations with people on podcasts like this, and even with somebody at the RBA, I was worried about stagflation, or essentially a
Yeah.
stagnation in our economic activity while we have inflation, because that's what
Yeah.
happened in the 70s if you've read your historical textbooks. So that was something I was worried about, but everybody was poo-pooing it at the time, oh no, it's fine, we'll have low interest rates forever, whatever. But in fact, we were creating the very inflationary conditions that we're living through right now. So that's another kind of monetary reason why you may see increases in prices, not just for cheese, but for many things, is that there's just more money around to soak up. And so prices on aggregate kind of go up.
Okay. So the next question is, I always thought inflation was regional, or it was localized. as far as a problem went.
Mm.
Why is it a seemingly global problem? Is it because surely we've got over COVID or the COVID era policies now, and all the money going into the economy and stuff?
Well, I mean, you're right that many, many, many moons ago, there will have been a more regional component to inflation because of the fact that there wasn't as much of an interdependent global economy as there is now. But now, and a good example of this, for example, that occurs to me would be Sweden. They didn't have the COVID lockdowns, but they still had a bit of an economic slump, not a huge one, but a bit of one during the COVID era because everybody they traded with was having lockdowns, right? So
Yeah.
and
Okay.
they need to get their products sold to these other markets and they need to buy the other markets products, but those products aren't coming onto the shore, right? Or Sweden isn't really a high port country, but they weren't coming through. And so that is going to affect the economy of Sweden. Similarly, here in Australia, if something happens in China, construction industry decides, maybe takes off or declines or whatever, that's going to affect us because we sell a lot of iron ore to China, right? And so that's going to filter
Yeah.
through to us. And the same thing can happen with inflation because a lot of industries that we benefit from at the final supermarket or retail moment are dependent on global supply chains. If those global supply chains are disrupted, if there is a higher cost to actually disseminating goods to many countries in the world, including Australia, then we may feel some higher costs of that. So it's not just the Australian farmer making the cheese, but we might be importing cheese from Norway, and the cheese gets put on a container ship and then gets bombed in the middle of the Red Sea because of the Middle Eastern tensions, and then we have to not have that cheese, right? And so that means that the next lot of cheese will probably try to increase prices to recoup the losses, right? And so
Yeah.
that means a higher price of cheese for us. So when you have this kind of global higher inflation, is partly because everybody almost did the lockdowns. So almost everybody
Yeah.
had a similar kind of approach. In the US, you also had fiscal stimulus. I even got a couple checks as a US citizen. And Europe also had the same. So you have that kind of common fiscal response, but also there's a interdependent global supply chain issue that's affecting everybody.
All right. So okay. So to discuss solutions, we need to understand the problem. I've put together a little mud map of how my simple mind works. So if I just show you this, and you can tell me how wrong I am, but if maybe I'm not so wrong, but who knows? Let me just share my screen. There, there, and share. Okay, so I was because you very rarely when politicians are discussing the solutions of these, they're very rarely discussing a lot of the issues. It would seem it's so,
Sure.
that they're simply targeting one little part.
Yep.
So you you've obviously got to, for me, you've actually got to target a whole range of things. So if I look at the prices, especially prices going up,
Mm-hmm.
we don't refine fuel anymore
Yep.
in Australia, so it's imported, and then you've got your overseas and obviously the price of fuel is going up overseas, so that's affecting your overseas supply chains.
Yeah. It's not the
That's
only thing that affects them,
affecting
but
your production supply.
it is one thing that affects them. Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, and then international, and then obviously as Australia goes, you've got international shipping, and then so your costs in your overseas supply chains then they're going to affect your electricity and gas prices.
Mm-hmm.
For example, if we're going green now, we don't make solar panels here, so you've got everything's pretty well imported for except the sun and the sun and the wind
Yeah.
for for electricity and gas. And then you've got your local supply chains, so your local production, your labour, your freight, all that sort of stuff that you've sort of mentioned. Um, that's relying on componentry and a lot of stuff still from overseas.
Mm-hmm.
And so, so that's all, as you say, going to be affecting food, housing, how much it costs to run a vehicle, how much it costs to run public transport, the education system, the health. So as far as looking at as speaking about government, shouldn't they be trying to attack or trying to look at these main
Well,
areas
there's a couple things
or
to
or
say. So the first thing I would say is that you're focusing very strongly on fuel and energy, and it is true that energy
yeah.
is a fundamental underpinning of economic production in goods and services around the world, right? So yes, but there are
Hmm.
other things that go into making goods and services, including, for example, human capital, right? So
Yeah.
as an Australian, you know that we have pretty high Australian domestic wage rates relative to a lot of our peer nations, and also certainly relative to many people in our region, many other countries. And so that means that when a company is deciding where it's going to produce things, it might not decide to come to Australia because the labor costs are very high if the production method that it has in mind is very labor intensive. Yeah. And it also means that if
Yeah.
overseas, there's a war on, let's say, that makes it more difficult for them to produce or whatever, difficult to get labor because everybody's being killed or whatever, then that's going to affect the costs of production, right? And so there are other things. Human capital is probably would be my number one choice as something you've left out of there. But there are also other
Yeah.
kinds of things that are not exactly as fundamental as energy, but are still very important intermediate materials that go into producing things. And for example, like whether cotton grows well in your country or whether you have fertile grounds for wheat or something else
Yeah.
will determine whether or not it's kind of optimal in some sense for you as a country to be specializing in making a particular thing. And if that's possible for a country to specialize in an area where they have what we would call a natural comparative advantage, then that often is something that which will bring down prices around the world for that product as long as trade is possible. So this is one of the fundamental insights of economics, is that there is heterogeneity, there is diversity across countries in what we're best at, right? Based on
Yeah.
things like what energy, of course, but also the kinds of things that will grow and that live in our climates, and also the institutional environment, like how high the wages are that we pay or whatever. And those things determine sort of what we optimally will specialize in, and then that's why people trade with international partners, because Australia doesn't want to have to make everything itself. It would be very inefficient as a maker of things that it instead then gets from another country, and that makes everybody better off. So I do think that it's possible to overemphasize the need to make everything in Australia. Yeah? Because some things
Yeah.
we're not going to be great at. Now, I do think that it is not a good idea ever to fully lock yourself into one particular supplier of a good or service. Yeah? That's something we've had an
Yeah.
issue with in relation to China and the demand for iron ore. It's something that we sometimes have an issue with even when buying only from Australia, because then, like, for example, bananas, we only have Australian grown bananas on the shelves here because of our
Yeah.
biosecurity laws. That means that if a cyclone comes through and knocks out 30% of the banana crop in far north Queensland, consumers have to pay $16 a kilo for their bananas. It's nuts. The Kiwis import bananas from the Philippines,
Yeah.
right? And so that enables them to be diversified in their supply and therefore get away from the huge welfare cost of a natural disaster like that. So, anyway, that's just to say that there are other things going on other than just fuel. Now, on your point about the
Yeah.
politicians, you know, fuel right now is a really, really hot topic, right? Because of the
Yeah.
whole political explosion around climate change and, green energy and blah, 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 blah. The way that I see this is that there are just a huge number of political reasons for the politicians today to be um, posturing and posing as environmentally protective in their policies. Those policies may not really be environmentally protective, and they may well be very economically damaging. But because of the lack of economic literacy or the low economic literacy in this country, the politicians often don't get asked about these things, and you really don't have
Yeah.
a good quality, robust, respectful discussion about these very important issues like energy. What is the best way for us to be powering our economy going forward? What's the role for government in the energy markets, right? We need to have those conversations in a sane
Yeah.
fashion without the fanaticism that happens on either side, frankly. But unfortunately, now what we have is just a lot of political posturing, a lot of playing to people's, bleeding heart about the environment and climate change, a lot of their fear that, we're killing the planet by driving our cars and things like this. And that crowds out sensible discussion. that could lead to policies
Yeah.
that both protect the environment and help people. So that's my concern there.
Well, yeah, is this something we've been? I suppose there's two parts of that. So, has globalization been happening over for the last? So as far as supply chains go,
Yeah,
and Australia really doesn't manufacture anything anymore.
not
It
much.
might have a few small manufacturers here and there, but not much. But has the supply chains been getting smaller as people um, probably chase profit, I suppose, as industry chases profit, which is right. I mean, a business can't survive without being profitable. But are we seeing something that's probably happened over 30, 40 years, which is globalization sort of affecting where we are at the moment?
Well, there definitely, yeah,
Is
there has been increasing globalization, of course, as you know. And what has happened mainly is that Australia has found itself outcompeted by other countries. So, for example, the Holden factory in South Australia, right? That just kind of went belly up because other countries can just make those cars more cheaply. That's just it, right?
yeah,
So we have found ourselves in the position of not being internationally competitive in a lot of manufacturing industries. Now, there is a way out of that. One of the reasons why that's the case, by the way, is that our labor costs are very high, right? So you're
yeah,
not going to get an advantage in anything that has a serious labor component. Also, our education system is meh, not great. And we don't have a lot of investment, enough investment, in my view, into technical trades. I don't know how you feel about it, but the last time I had to find a plumber, I mean, it was like the worst experience of my life, right? Can't find people who are skilled in the trades that keep economies moving. And that is a major problem. So that is another thing, right? Investment in education isn't kind of being directed in the right way. We got a lot of people coming here to study at universities when really they probably shouldn't,
yeah,
right? So there's a lot of issues on the structural side, I suppose, of why we have found ourselves to be uncompetitive. But there is kind of a direction that you can move in as a government, and that's what I think Albanese is attempting to do. Whether I think it's going to be successful or not, which we've seen in the past, that can kind of increase your competitiveness on the global scale in a particular industry. So Singapore has done this, Korea has done this. Basically, it's a find a particular industry you think that you can develop a comparative advantage in, and then plunge money into that as a government, subsidize very hard, and so that you can kind of bring the industry up to speed, up to international competitiveness, and then ideally get out so that the market
yeah,
can take over, right? Because you don't want to be promoting long-term dependence on the government for companies, because that's a zero win strategy for anybody. So for the country, certainly. So if that were the
yeah,
case here, right, if you could save, if the government's top economic analyst could say, well, that industry right there, if we could just subsidize a bit of investment there, because for whatever reason the private sector isn't investing, and you have to think about why they're not investing. If we could just subsidize that for a brief period of time, 3 years, 5 years, whatever, and then bring them up to speed and then get out of the way, maybe we could create an internationally competitive manufacturing industry in that area. And I think that's what he is trying to appear that he's doing with this Made in Australia policy.
yeah.
Yeah.
But as far as manufacturing, don't a lot of countries still subsidize their manufacturing though?
Yeah.
I mean, as far as the car industry goes, I know Australia got rid of it, and I would have been one of the people saying, "Look, it's not efficient. We're putting so much money into it." But now I'll actually look at where we are,
Mm,
and you sit there and you think about the industries we lost from removing the car industry
mm,
and skills and all that sort of stuff.
yep.
Um, it makes you wonder, like, well, maybe that was actually a good investment in subsidizing that industry
Mm.
because of all the offshoots from it. So
Yeah. Yeah.
uh,
So, I mean, that,
a subsidies and not full on protect. I guess you're not wanting to go full on protection, but a subsidy's a really bad thing. It means it seems everyone's all for free trade agreements now, and surely free trade agreements are only great for big business.
well, I mean, free trade agreements in theory are great for anybody, any country that can produce a good at low cost and high quality. Right. That's kind
Yeah.
of how it is. Now, how you do that, whether you use government subsidies to do that or not, is another question entirely. And you're right that a lot of subsidies still exist for certain industries that are considered to be nationally important. So, for example, in Europe, agriculture is massively subsidized, right? Because
Yeah.
considered to be sort of culturally important. We don't want France to stop making cheese or wine because it's like a
Mm.
national thing, like that's their thing. And if they stop, then what is France even for? So as labor costs have risen, as there's been sort of just an increase in living standards and sort of an inability to fully compete with, say, middle income countries that may have pretty prosperous areas for wine growing in terms of making wine. I mean, Argentina comes to mind. There's sort of been an awareness, a developing awareness that maybe, as you say, there are other reasons to support that industry governmentally. And, subsidies are a mechanism of protection. That is a mechanism of protecting the industry from, really facing the full frontal assault of international competition, right? And so we can do that as well with manufacturing. That again, the issue is, well, how long or to what extent do you want to have that still in place? Because the more that the industries in a particular country are dependent on the government, the less that you're going to necessarily see innovation, right? Because there's not
Hmm.
competitive pressure. Competitive pressure is what drives new ways of doing things, right? It's that
Yeah.
competition, it's the desperation, and at the end of the day, innovation is the only thing that actually spurs growth. That's the
Yeah.
cause of growth, right? And so if we want to keep growing in terms of our living standards, which most people want that, because that yields more money to spend on everything, including the environment and subsidies and everything else, right? Then you do want to
Yeah.
ensure that innovation is still happening. And so that's one of my major concerns with too much government intervention, is that it can make industry leaders and just companies in general too relaxed.
Lazy.
Yeah, right. And not really wanting to find
Lazy.
that
Yeah.
next innovation. Yeah.
And I suppose you saw that with, um, uh, as far as taking the easy route goes, or taking the easy money. You saw that with the lobsters, the lobster fishermen down in Tasmania over COVID.
Yeah.
They were getting I think it was $120 a kilo, selling them to China.
Hmm.
That they stopped buying them. Suddenly they're selling them in Australia for $60 a kilo.
Yeah.
You know,
Yep.
um, but it is an interesting conversation, and it's it just seems everyone is simply against subsidies or protecting business to a degree. It seems it's got to be free trade and all market, and
Well, I
but
would say that
I don't see how it can be.
no, there's definitely a range of opinions on this. I mean, Australia is more of an interventionist economy than, for example, the U.S. or a lot of other countries. And it's definitely not the case that markets work perfectly in every industry. I mean, there are plenty of cases of natural monopolies where you need to have some kind of government intervention in order to avoid consumers, being just over, steamrolled by big monopolies. Monopolies also,
Um,
by the way, are a situation where you don't have enough competitive pressure. So that means that you're going to get higher prices and, underproduction or lower product quality and all that sort of thing. So that's bad for consumers. So there's a
yeah,
balance. And that's why we have organizations like the Productivity Commission, for example, and the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission. These are sort of quangos, quasi-governmental organizations that are sort of slightly independent of government and trying to comment on the wisdom of various degrees of government intervention in different kinds of industries, and whether or not more is needed or less is needed in order to promote competition and therefore innovation and productivity, but also kind of a good quality of life for Australians and full employment and these other things that we really want to get out of our economy, right? A quality of life, just everybody having a longer life and a better quality life in those years.
do you think? I suppose on the behavioural side of things, the psychology side of things, do you think people have gotten gotten lazy or comfortable? Take the duopoly for take the Woolworths and Coles duopoly for example.
Yep.
The person Have people forgotten that we're actually in control of where we buy stuff. We don't have to go to Coles or Woolworths. There's markets, there's greengrocers, there's butchers, there's it is harder. It is probably something that does take more time, and people are time precious, or time poor, I should say. Um, I mean, for me, going to and from work takes 2.5 hours out of my day when I'm not working from home. But it's like, and so probably the easiest thing is to just go into Coles or Woolworths.
Yeah,
But
yeah. No,
it seems like we've gotten to a point where it's like, oh, Woolworths and Coles is the only place we can go.
I think that you're right. That attitude is unfortunately pretty common. But I think as the cost of living has increased, people have increasingly been looking for places that they can find extra dollars. And one place is to price shop, right? To shop around and find
Yeah,
the price. And I think that's a good thing in the sense that it reignites some of that competitive pressure in the grocery industry. Because I mean, you're not if you're not always going to buy your apples at Kohl's, and in fact, when they're charging 25 cents a kilo more than your local greengrocer, then Kohl's will be forced, if they want to get rid of their apples, to lower their price, right? That's how it works. And I actually teach this to my students, my first year economics students. I say, look, if you buy a faulty product from some company here in Australia, please do not just go right back to that same store and buy the same thing again, because that's not providing the signal that that supplier needs, that it's not good enough. Right? You just, for the
yeah.
sake of Australia, you need to shop around, find a place that actually does have a better quality product, and buy it from them. And if possible, if you want to really encourage Australian businesses, buy locally or buy something that's made in Australia, sure. But if you can't find something that's high quality that's made in Australia, buy overseas. I mean, you are, as the consumer, as you say, you do have the power to send signals to our suppliers that say, this is something you should be producing versus this is something you shouldn't be producing, or maybe you should, but the price is too high, or, you need to clean up your production processes or whatever. Because otherwise, how do they know?
Well, that's right. I mean, ultimately, we've got the power to make. Well, as a collective, we've got power to make or break,
Yep.
and it seems to be being forgotten.
Yeah.
But
Well, that's part of the
anyway,
economic literacy problem, I think, that we have more broadly.
yeah,
People don't really understand the way that supply and demand works, but if they did, I think they might feel a
yeah,
bit more empowered, which would be a good thing.
yeah. Okay. Economics is a balancing act, and deciding to act on one problem in the economy may adversely affect another part of the economy. We need to prioritize what we want to achieve and understand the effects of some basic decisions we make, decisions we make that they can have. Are there any simple rules that someone can look to when thinking about economics, not just in inflation and cost of living, but just in economics in general?
In terms of deciding where to spend the extra marginal dollar?
Yeah, spend money, or as far as understanding policy
Hmm.
governments putting out, or just some basic economic rules, I
Um,
suppose. That
Well, I
probably
mean,
not.
certainly what you say about needing to prioritize and things being interlinked is very true. I suppose the most fundamental pillar conceptually of the discipline is opportunity cost. And if you understand opportunity cost, then you understand much better how to evaluate whether a particular policy is a good idea. So, opportunity cost is the value of the next best alternative that you forego when you spend on a given alternative. So, let's say I have A and B as two options, two ways to spend $100, and I say, okay, I'm going to spend it
Yeah,
on A, right? When I spend it on A, I'm obviously spending $100, right? So that's part of my cost, and I get some benefit. But what I'm also kind of, in an unseen way, foregoing is the value that I might have gotten if I had instead taken that $100 and spent it on B. Right?
yeah,
So if I got a higher value from spending that $100 on B than I would have if I spent it on A, I should have spent it on B instead, right?
yeah,
But we don't ever see that value foregone in a spreadsheet or whatever, or advertised in a policy or whatever, right? That's something that's kind of in our minds. It's a hypothetical,
yeah,
something we have to imagine, and we have to. There's so many things you have to imagine in order to even think about quantifying that. For one thing, you have to figure out what you would have done with the money if not item A, right? What is item
Yeah.
right? Geez. And that's not easy because there's always a multitude of ways to spend money, right? I mean, lobbyists are thronging to Parliament every single day, putting their hands out,
No.
saying, give me more, give me more. I deserve it more. I deserve it more. Everybody wants more, right? And the iron law of scarcity says that not everybody can have as much as they all want, right? And so we have to prioritize. But as a policymaker, if you are truly benevolent, if you are truly maximizing in your policy recommendations the expected total aggregate social welfare of Australia, which is what I teach my students is the way that a proper economist should be orienting him or herself, then what you're
Yeah.
thinking about is which of the policies available to me will deliver the greatest amount of that welfare for a given dollar that I'm spending on it. And so that means you have to have this kind of broad view of all the different expenditure areas that the government has the potential to spend in. So that's education and health and infrastructure and, everything else that they spend on welfare payments and everything else. And you have to sort of have a sense roughly of how much bang you're getting, how much welfare, how much human quality of life, human satisfaction, happiness, whatever you want to call it, are you getting from those expenses, so that the next time that you have
Yeah.
an extra dollar to spend, okay, look, I think right there, that area is one where I can get the highest return, in terms of social welfare for this dollar, so that's where I'm going to spend it. So that's the kind of, I guess, framework that I would advise people having when they're thinking about whether a policy is optimal. And it's hard to have that because, different people, different groups in society benefit from different policies. So you are often talking about, a policy that benefits a particular group over here versus another policy that benefits another group over here. Whichever one is
Yeah.
financed, the other one loses, right? And so as an economist, we have to be very objective and sort of say, look, what I want is to maximize total social welfare. So, which of these groups actually, in a sense, needs it more? Which one is going to have delivered to it the highest amount of welfare gain from this expenditure? Right? They're both going to be screaming like baby birds, feed me, feed me, feed me. Economist, you have to be thinking for the good of all, which group is going to be benefiting more from this dollar, right? And that's a really difficult decision. That's one of the reasons we're so unpopular, right? Because we're never fully in
Yeah.
any person's corner. We're in the corner of Australia. And there's really
Yeah.
very few representatives of that, unfortunately, in our society today.
So how you can get how your $1 or how your dollar can affect most of the people. Yeah.
The highest number of people is part of it, but it's also how
Yeah.
much welfare, right? From how much extra benefit from that particular expenses. So if people are interested, I actually wrote back in 2022 a cost benefit analysis of Australia's lockdown policies with Sanjeev Sablock, who is an ex-Victorian Treasury economist. We wrote it because the government has yet to come out with a cost benefit analysis of the lockdown policy, but this is the standard analytical method of evaluating government policy to estimate
Yeah.
the costs and the benefits of the policy, right? And usually you do it for a range of policies, and then you select which policy gives you the highest ratio of benefits to cost. In our case, we just did it for the lockdowns because that was what we actually saw being implemented. And we
Yeah.
find in that analysis, we find that the costs of the lockdowns were something like 68 times the value of the benefits they could possibly have delivered. And that was using assumptions that were quite generous to lockdowns, assuming the lockdowns were actually saving people, which is quite debatable. So, that
Yeah.
was an example. So if people are interested, that book is called Do Lockdowns and Border Closures Serve the Greater Good? And it's Connor Court 2022. So people can find it on Amazon.
Oh, okay, cool. I actually might have a look at that. Okay, so back to inflation and cost of living and what the Reserve Bank, government, business, and us as individuals can do. Firstly, in front of everyone's minds, the Reserve Bank.
Yep.
What's their role?
Well,
What do they do?
So they set the cash rate, right, which is the overnight borrowing rate between banks. And what that is an interest rate that flows through to all other financial vehicles that carry interest rates in the economy, with various, but pretty fast usually, certainly if it's a rate rise. And essentially that causes, so when the RBA raises a rate, that means that people who are paying back mortgages on variable rate mortgages are going to see an increase in the rate of interest on that mortgage, and therefore an increase in the payment that they have to make every month on their mortgage. About 30% of
Yep.
Australians roughly are holding a mortgage on their house. So when the RBA increases those rates, 30% roughly of Australians will directly be hit by an increase in their mortgage payments, monthly mortgage payments, within a pretty tight time frame, because those banks are likely to pass that on quite quickly because it's more profit for them, right? So that's one of the major mechanisms through which the rising of those rates is going to cause sort of a taking of heat out of the economy, because those homeowners don't have as much money now to spend on other things, right? So they're not going to be
Yep.
buying as much. The demand that they have for food, energy, everything else, holidays, etc., is going to fall, which means that you're going to sort of take some wind out of the economy. You're going to have less demand. It's going to sort of calm things down, and hopefully there'll be a little bit less inflation, so less pressure for those prices to keep going up. Now, one of the reasons why the RBA rate rises have not fully reduced inflation back to the target rate that the RBA has of 2 to 3% is that it's just one mechanism. It's just one lever, right, that the RBA has.
Yep.
It doesn't have control over fiscal policy, which we were talking about earlier.
No.
So the COVID era job seeker payments, those were coming from the government purse, not from the RBA. And those were very highly inflationary. And what can the RBA do about that? I mean, it was essentially kind of helping in a way behind the scenes when the government was doing that. But now, what is it going to do? It's just got to raise the rates. It's, maybe trading some bonds, but it's, there's not much that it's going to be able to do in the fiscal space. And so that means that it's kind of got its hands tied, right? It's only able to really directly affect that 30%. Now, other people are holding, like maybe people who are having investment properties, let's say, they may also be holding some mortgages. So maybe slightly more than 30% of Australians would feel a bit of a pinch from those rising rates. But you also will see some effects in, investment. So investment into various different projects might actually go up when you have a higher rate of return. So there's all different kinds of effects on the economy that may happen, and not all of them are necessarily going to be anti-inflationary. But of course, the RBA is also not just looking at inflation when it decides what to do with rates. It's also looking at things like the employment market, right? What's going on with the labor market, whether or not other signals of the economy are sort of looking like the economy is going grow, or whether people's confidence is coming down. Because of course, the RBA does want to return rates to that 2 to 3%, but it also doesn't want people to, get sort of, to have basically high unemployment or recessionary conditions to start feeling less confident. And because that also is a major problem. So you do want to bring the rates down. That's what they call a soft landing, right? You're bringing the rates down and you're not creating a recession in doing it. And that's not always the easiest thing to do.
So the only thing, well, their only tool really is interest rates, as you're saying, and they're just trying to remove a bit of money from the economy. That's all they're trying to do.
That's the main thing.
Which is why, as you say, the other side of the coin of rising interest rates is the government if you put your money in the bank, you get a greater return on it.
Exactly.
Which means you're not spending it. So you're still taking it out of the economy. You're not spending it, but you're getting a higher interest rate.
Exactly. That's right. And you might imagine that, maybe, for example, purchases of homes might go down, right? Because higher interest rates, and that would be a very good thing for the housing market. We have this massive housing problem in Australia. It's one of the biggest components of the cost of living problem right now, particularly for young people, and certainly for people who have mortgages, obviously. And it's just obscene. I mean, it's I don't even, words fail me how the government has allowed things to get this way. And if people are interested in,
it's another topic I want to do.
Yeah, well, I tell you, you should ask Cameron Murray. I think he's probably the best property economist in Australia. He wrote just recently a book called The Great Housing Hijack, and he lives in Queensland. I would definitely advise that you bring him on, and he can talk to you all about how different policies might be helpful in ameliorating that housing market problem. And I can tell you what it isn't is just giving government subsidies for first home buyers. That's not that helpful, because that's, again, inflationary, right? It may help for a buyer, but it's inflationary as a whole.
Well, it's interesting. The housing market is interesting, I suppose. And as affordability, I suppose, I think what I don't understand, I suppose, and it's why I want to do it, is back in the 70s, the household was one income, and they're able to afford a house.
Yep.
Now, I think the to be able to afford a house in Melbourne or Sydney, your average income's got to be $130,000. That's a fairly high income for one person.
Yep.
And so, how can you actually consider housing affordability when you essentially do need two incomes
Yep.
to run a house or to be able to afford a house?
Absolutely.
And I suppose it's not just Sydney and Melbourne anymore; it's Brisbane, it's Adelaide,
Sure. Well, I
all
mean,
of them.
honestly, I think Brisbane and well, other cities apart from Sydney and Melbourne are not as badly off, but they are having problems too, certainly.
Yeah,
And you're right. I mean, when you make housing that expensive, you're curtailing consumer choice and you're curtailing family choice. So you're making it kind of less possible for couples to specialize the way that they might like to. You know, they have to put both people in the market. For example, some couples might prefer to have only one person in the market, but it becomes virtually impossible to do that if you have to cover this, astronomical cost of either a mortgage repayment or rent. Right. And
yeah,
so, and that's not good for Australia because again, you want people making choices that are best for them locally. That is how you get growth. That's how you get optimal allocation of resources. If you have people constrained by, government policies or by just is in particularly markets of for core goods like housing or groceries or anything else,
yeah,
eating, then you're really putting a major strangle on people's ability to choose what they want to choose, and that's a serious problem for optimal allocation of resources. So I'm very worried about that.
yeah. Well, it's one of the mental health things.
Yeah.
It's life quality, isn't it? People just feel like they are literally going to work and going to work, paying the bills, going to work and paying the bills.
Yeah.
You know,
No. And
that's literally how they feel. And then they're not only that, they're spending a few hours of a day in a car, possibly, or
yeah.
commuting,
Well,
and
I mean,
it's just
there's another podcast right there because I mean, one
yeah,
of the
exactly,
big impacts of COVID, the COVID era, not the COVID virus, but the COVID era, the
yeah,
policies we chose has been to draw people away from each other and to
yeah,
divest from our communities, from our social relationships, from normal human social behavior. So it's driven people away from each other generationally, it's along gender lines, along class lines, and that is again incredibly destructive, and we still haven't recovered from it. People are in a whole bunch of bad habits, and as you say, they feel constrained, they feel unable to really make choices about how they would like to live their life because they've got so many binding constraints financially and sometimes socially as well. And so that's a very negative situation. And again, that's something that I'm quite worried about, and it's one of the reasons why I founded Australians for Science and Freedom. I really want to try to build better institutions that bring communities back together and suit people's needs more, so they can make more choices that are good for them.
yeah. Okay, so as far as government goes, there's five parts to this question. So I'll go through them one at a time, which we've already touched on. Is what we are experiencing an issue that has been brewing for 30 to 40 years as the world has become more global?
Do you want me to answer
Which,
as we go? I mean, certainly,
yeah,
yeah, there is an effect of globalization over the last 30 or 40 years, but that's not only a negative thing, right? So I would definitely emphasize global trade has actually improved our lives. I mean, most things you pick up in this office were not made in Australia, and there's a reason for that. So I think we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but certainly
yeah,
we are all interdependent. Then when a global crisis hits, it hits everybody.
yeah. Okay, so next question is: we're told not all government spending is inflationary. So what is inflationary and non-inflationary government spending?
Well, so that's a good question, and it's not always immediately obvious. In general, if the government is spending on something that the private sector wouldn't already spend, because
Yeah,
otherwise, why are you doing it? And B is directly related to increasing productivity, for example. Um, those are kind of key little indicators that maybe it's not going to be inflationary. So if you want to say something like subsidizing apprenticeships in TAFE, let's take that as an
yeah,
example, right? Unlikely that private industry would finance that in a large degree, maybe a little bit, but not hugely. So you're not necessarily crowding out private investment. And you're also hopefully investing in the productivity of Australia because you're increasing the level of skill that we have, which enables people to be more productive on the job. So that may be less likely to be inflationary. Certainly, just handing out stimulus checks to people who are sitting at home because the government told them that they couldn't go to work is going to be inflationary, right? So that's a clear
Yeah.
example. And other things that's kind of on, there's sort of gray areas. Is it inflationary when you have a public-private partnership to build a huge light rail line out from the center of Sydney to UNSW? Well,
Yeah.
you are kind of making yet another transport line along a corridor that already had pretty good service from buses. You're making a lot of jobs, which I guess is good, but that means you're paying those people more money maybe than they would have otherwise made. So you're putting more money into the economy. But it is an infrastructure thing, and as we grow, we do need more infrastructure, and that's kind of a positive thing that encourages more efficiency and productivity. So it's hard to tell with some categories.
Yeah. Okay. So, is it impossible to implement policies that fix both inflation and cost of living at the same time?
Yeah. Well, I mean,
Because
a lot of
because
those policies.
I see inflation as you got to take money out, and cost of living, it's like you've got to put some money back into it. So it's like,
Yeah, well, not necessarily. So I would say a lot of those kinds of policies would be to get out of the way, actually.
yeah,
So, for example, in childcare, right? I've been banging on about this for 10 years, easily, probably 15 years. We have a very highly regulated childcare industry in this country. When I was in the
yeah,
US, which is where I had my babies, we put the babies into family daycare, and it was easy to find, and it was cheap, and it was fine. And we were the ones, as parents, who vetted the people we were considering hiring, right? We went and we visited, we took a
yeah,
tour, we kind of talked to the other parents. We basically did our own quality control. Yeah. And that does mean that yes, you're trusting your child to then, once you've made the judgment, you leave your child with that woman and you hope that it's going to be fine, and it was fine. You kind of have to trust your own nose to make sure that it's going to be okay. Here in Australia, the government has taken it upon itself, its own shoulders, to regulate the industry to such an extent that anybody who was thinking like me, I was thinking years ago that I might go to become a childcare provider when I get to be 65, because I love kids, love kids, right? And I looked into it at one stage, and I just paled at the amount of red tape that is there, the things you have to do and things you can't do, and this, that, and the other stupid stuff, which I don't think necessarily relates to the safety of the children, or the quality
yeah,
of the care of the children, or the quality of the education provided to the children. And so that is an example where I think the government is overstepping its core business, and it could just sort of walk back from that, and that would probably make childcare less expensive, because then the childcare providers wouldn't have to pay the compliance costs with all this regulation and certification and all this sort of jazz. And it would be
yeah,
less inflationary, because you're basically just saying, look, people can pay whatever and they will pay less, and that's going to be a smaller amount of cost. You're then liberating labor that maybe couldn't afford childcare before, or couldn't find childcare before, to, if it wants to, like labor of mothers or fathers who want to enter the labor market, they can do so. So that's good for the economy.
yeah,
So yeah, that's an example. So just generally reducing red tape would, in my view, be one of the things you could do as a government that would reduce kind of the general stresses of cost of living, because the red tape causes costs to suppliers, which then pass that cost on to the consumer. And it would also
yeah,
provide more consumer choice to people. There are other kinds of government expenses on welfare systems, for example, that could be helpful for people who are at bottlenecks in their lives, but aren't necessarily that inflationary, because they're going to spend the money on food, for example, or just basic
yeah,
needs. And we do want, as a society, to take care of people's basic needs, right? It's very going hungry, people are going without heating, right? So that's something where government does have a clear role, and generally speaking, people won't think of basic welfare as being too inflationary. But there are economists who will argue we shouldn't have any of that. I don't agree with that, but I think
yeah,
you can make an argument, I suppose, if you want to.
yeah. Okay, so what types of policies do we need to implement now to lower both inflation and ease the cost of living, do you think?
Well, again, government getting out of the way. Some investment in education, I think, would be good. Um, Gosh, I mean, there are so many different areas where government spends money where I think it could be done better. The health system is an example. I don't know if you've tracked this, but over the last 20 to 30 years, expenses in health have gone up and up and up as a percentage of GDP, and we haven't really gotten commensurate gains in quality of life or longevity. So you have to ask yourself, what are we spending that money on exactly? And why are we not getting the returns that we should when we're spending so much more of our GDP on these things than we used to? So I would say have an independent review of expenditure in health. And my sense is there's a lot of corruption in that industry, a lot of waste, a lot of wasteful expenditure that could just be repurposed to something else. Like, for example, how about we invest in clean water wells and other technology for rural Australia? A lot of people in Australia don't have
Yeah,
clean water. You kind of need that in order to be able to enter markets, in order to be secure, in order to, be able to rise up on the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? So that for me, that's more of a priority than sort of, channeling more millions or billions of dollars into more mRNA vaccine development or whatever, right? That it's just we need to be
yeah,
thinking about the more basic needs that our society has, and stop funneling money to industries that are really well plugged into the departments that give them money. So I would say a kind of a reassessment of where we're spending the big bucks and whether we really could be getting more of a return, like we were talking about before, in terms of human
yeah.
welfare if we spend it in a different way.
Okay, so does business have a role to play in resolving these problems, or is their role merely moral, community orientated, all that sort of jazz?
I mean, business is naturally profit seeking, right? That's what we have to
Yeah,
expect. And the thing that keeps businesses in check is competition, right? As we said before,
yeah,
it's not that businesses, that a business that's monopolistic is going to suddenly be bitten by the Morgan, decide that it's only going to ever do good things. Forget about that. That just does not work.
yeah,
Now, sometimes companies can sort of ride the emotional wave that comes along from customers that want to buy from companies that seem to be doing the right thing, right? So you see this in terms of green projects or whatever, right? Unfortunately, a lot of the time that's more imaging and marketing than it is reality. So I don't put a lot of stake in that.
greenwashing.
Yeah, greenwashing, exactly. So I don't really think that's a way to help pretty much anybody. I think that's just a way for businesses to
No,
get more market share for doing things that aren't necessarily pro environment or pro people. And oftentimes those are the
yeah,
same thing because people live in the environment and they care about the environment, particularly in Australia. So, I see businesses as inherently profit motivated, and really that they just need to be liberated to feel that they can take risks and experiment, and they can be optimistic about the future, and they can try new things, because that's ultimately what we look to the private sector to provide for us is
yeah.
increases in productivity through experimentation and innovation and doing things slightly differently, right? So I want to see businesses and business leaders feeling confident to do those things, because that's what will deliver welfare to people.
Yeah. Okay, so finally, the individual us. What role do we play? I'm guessing we've already discussed this as well, which is we control. We decide where we spend our money, and to stop inflation, we can actually put it in the bank rather than spend it.
We certainly can. We can also direct our money towards particular suppliers that we think are providing a good product, even though they may not have a large
Yeah,
market share, right? And we can also, I think, at a non-economic level, more kind of community or social or even spiritual level, we can respect one another and talk about economics and talk about issues and hold our politicians to account and not be fooled by propaganda and teach our children to think critically, right? I mean, we can be
yeah,
proper, dutiful stewards of a civil society, and we've not been doing that very well, David. So I think that's,
no,
unfortunately, it is partially the fault of the kind of she'll be right, mate attitude of Australia, that we have had such criminal acts by our politicians and such betrayal of the people through our taking our eye off the ball, basically. So whenever power is involved, you need to be watchful, and so we need to be more watchful.
but that's also, I suppose, you could also say that's part of the media's role,
Yeah.
and having a biased media, which I mean, you're American, so,
Oh yeah.
so obviously you look at American media and it's seriously biased, but um, having a biased media or a weak media, that's actually part of it. That's a problem in society in itself, because it's not holding the politicians to account.
Totally. I mean, the fourth estate is basically not there anymore. I think, independent fourth estate. But
Yeah.
I mean, that's why your channel actually is an important part of the solution, and many of the other sort of independent channels that have sprung up in a lot of people are now tuning in to those more than they are to the mainstream channels. I mean, just to pick one example from America, the whole Tucker Carlson debacle, right? He was on Fox News and he was kicked off Fox News. Now he's on Twitter or X or whatever, and he gets even more viewers than the Fox News programs that he was on. So you have to just look at that and think, well, good, right? There's more competition, whether or not you agree with. There's more competition now, and that enables people to then make their own choices about what truth they choose to believe at this moment, right? I mean, there is kind of no absolute fundamental total truth. That's why this whole misinformation disinformation law is just an accident waiting to happen, because who is going to decide whether something's misinformation, right? We're always hoping to get towards the truth and never quite there, and it's just nuts to think that the government has a monopoly on truth. But no one channel does. That's the thing. No one person knows for sure the ultimate answer on any particular question. We're all just sort of trying, and so each individual citizen has to take the responsibility to put in the effort to think and consider their options, right? And then make up their mind, and then be open to new data and adapt with the times. And yeah, it's a difficult thing to do, to live in a democratic society. That's what you have to do. So I think we have to get used to a little bit more work and a little bit more discussion and debate and education about what is going on in our country, and what do we expect from our resource allocators, from our decision makers, from the people who are supposed to be serving us in politics.
Well, and yeah, exactly. And it is actually, as you say, discussing the problem for what it is, which is what I'm trying to do here, which is rather than actually take a side of the argument and then tell people what they've got to do and how to think and what to do, which is what you see. It's a lot easier to do that, as far as a commercial television could station or commercial media, everyday commercial media can do. They can do it in 5 minutes rather than do something over half an hour.
Yeah. No, that's right. I mean, but there are some organizations in Australia that give me hope. So there's an organization called the Brisbane Dialogues that you may have heard of in Queensland. They run these public forums, public events, where they've got people who are representing different sides of an issue, and they all come together in a theater, and they discuss the issue for an hour and a half. And that's
cool.
a really hot issue. So we did one on, I was in one that was called "How Do We Manage the Next Pandemic?" I think there's one on housing coming up. They're running one in Melbourne, actually, on housing. There was one on universal basic income several years ago. So, they pick big issues, big topical things, and they try to get discussion going. They try to model good discussion, respectful, informed, critical, not the ad hominem attacks, not the playing gotcha, not the point scoring that you see on the media often, or in Parliament even, but rather, real consideration in an adult fashion of the issues involved and the trade-offs involved. And the idea is to get to a position where at least most people around the table can agree that this thing is a good idea. So with universal basic income, for example, I was in that one, and we all came out at the end of the day agreeing that a negative income tax was a good policy idea. Great. So that means that all these sides of the debate, or the phenomenon, could agree on a particular policy. That gives a lot of weight to that policy then, and you can then have a conversation with politicians and say, hey, most people agree that, depending on what side you're on, doesn't really think this is a good idea.
So how does the universal basic income work then?
That's another
briefly, quickly. If that's another podcast. Okay, we won't go there. Let's not go there. Okay, so I actually, I think we've pretty well covered everything. Is there anything else we need to look at?
I might just give a small plug for those people who are listening who might have high school students who are interested in economics issues. Your sons or daughters may be interested. There is a high school competition in economics that I run called the Australian Economics Olympiad. You can find it on the web if you just Google Australian Economics Olympiad. And the registrations close in about a week or so, and any student from across Australia can participate. And it's a really exciting competition, squarely about economics, teaching critical analysis and proper understanding of economic issues. And for the winners of that, we also have an Australasian Economics Olympiad, which is an international competition that runs here at UNSW in July, which we fund. So if the student wins, then they'll be able to come here and meet me and do a whole bunch of activities with other people from across Australia. So it's a really exciting education initiative that I run. So I'd be encouraging your listeners to look it up.
Many moons ago, when I was in high school, there was mobile managing the economy game.
That sounds
sponsored by obviously oil. So it was the same. It was a computer program. You had to make policy changes. So you'd either just very simple things like you'd be increasing taxation to reduce to do whatever you wanted to do, and just simply managing the economy. So it was a bit of fun.
That sounds like something that probably, it'd be nice to have, because again, that encourages that holistic thinking. If you do one thing here, what's going to happen over here, and everything's all very interrelated.
Yeah. Well, exactly. Okay, so I think that pretty well wraps up the first episode of Educating Eggnham. Thank you for taking the time to talk to me, Gigi. It's been great, and and I guess until next time, everyone.